This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Now let's go through the arithmetic that can be needed, the entries that can be needed for sales tax. Look at example 1 first of all. It says Alpha sells goods at a net or tax exclusive price of $150. The rate of sales tax is 16%. And we're asked to calculate what's the gross price, what's the full selling price. Well, here I hope no problem. The net price, the price without tax, is $150. By law, they have to add on tax of 16%. Of $150, and so the tax they'll add on is $24, and so the final selling price, the gross price, or the price including the sales tax, will be $174. So no problem. Got to add on tax at whatever the rate is. However, where it gets slightly more fun, that was example 1, remember, is a lot of businesses do quote prices that way. They quote a price without tax, but the invoice will actually be for higher, as in this case. Certainly in shops normally the shop quotes the gross price including the tax. So certainly in a shop, this item in example 1, the price marked on it to be $174, but that's the actual amount you'd pay. It would actually include the tax. It would really be $150 plus 24. And what you can be asked in the exam is to work backwards. Look at example 2. Beta sells goods at a gross or tax-inclusive price of $120. So that's the final price including tax. The tax rate is 16%, and we're going to work backwards. What would the price have been without tax, the net price, and how much tax is included? Now there are several ways you can get the right answer here, and in the exam it's irrelevant how you do it. For some people this is immediately obvious, and if it is, by all means jump forward in this recording. But let's do it properly, because for some people it isn't obvious at all and does take a bit of practice. So I'll say any way you like. If you see a faster way for you, by all means. But just suppose the net price was X dollars. Well, if that's the net price, we've got to add on tax at 16%. And so surely the sales tax they'd add on would be 16%, 1600, so 0.16 times X. That would give us the full of the gross price, and here we know the gross price is 120. So on this approach it's now a bit of, I hope, fairly simple algebra to work backwards, work out what the net and the tax are. So x plus 1.16x is 1.16x, and therefore x, 120 divided by 1.16, which to the nearest cent, and in the exam usually you'll be required to do these to the nearest cent, is 103.45. And that, of course, is the net price. The question here says, what is the net price? Well, that's the answer to that. It also says, and what is the amount of the tax? Well, the tax, of course, 16% of the net price. Is $16.55. And although, for heaven's sake, in the exam, be confident you won't have time to waste to keep checking yourself. But here it would be silly not to check. The net price plus the tax should, of course, equal to the gross price. And it does. All right. So I have said already, if that's already obvious to you, no problem at all. If it isn't, go back through that slowly, make sure you are happy, because once you've got it, it's a very quick question in the exam. To make sure, can you have a go at example 3? Pause this recording, check example 3 yourself, and then switch back on and check you got it right. Well, I'll go through it. Example 3. Again, it's a work backwards one. We're given the gross price. The gross price is the net plus the tax will give us the gross. And so if the net price were X dollars, here the tax rate is 17.5%, or 0.175 times X, will equal a gross price of $2.20. Therefore 1.175X is $2.20, and X, the net price, is $2.20 divided by 1.175. You should have got, therefore, again to the nearest cent, you should have got $187.23. The question also wanted the tax, in fact, two ways. It's either the difference between $2.20 the gross and $187 the net, or, of course, it's 17.5% of the net price of $187.23. And so how much is the tax? You should have got $32.77. And I won't write down, but I can do in my head. Add them together. It does come to 220. All right. So again, you are very likely indeed to get probably only one question, but certainly one question in the exam actually calculating tax. And almost certainly what we've done here, being given the gross and going back to the net, which I think you'd all agree is clearly that little bit less obvious than the first example. Having sorted that out, though, the other thing they can check you on is that we do know how we account for sales tax. So, although the entries are listed on page 27 and you can look back through them yourself, rather than talk through them, it's better to illustrate them with an example. Can you turn to example 4 on page 28? In example 4, very short one, but it gives us our purchases and our sales for December. Bought goods on credit. The sales tax involved, so $432 was the net amount, but because of tax we actually got charged $507,600. Our sales on credit again would have been $624, but we had to add on sales tax. We're actually charging $733,200. Now, obviously, in practice, every individual purchase and sale would be recorded. We can only do it on the total. But let's have a go. Let's deal with the purchases first of all. We're buying goods on credit, and the total invoice is $507,600. And so whatever happens, we've got to pay the supplier $507,600. And so my first entry, I'll credit the payables with the amount we owe. We owe $507,600, fine, credit payables. Credit payables with the gross amount. That's the cash we'll end up having to pay. Where are we going to debit? Well, of course, normally when you buy goods, look back to chapter 3 if you need, but when you buy goods for resale, normally debit purchases credit cash if you haven't paid, or, as here, credit payables with the amount you owe. So we'll debit purchases. However, we'll only debit purchases with the net amount, which is 432,000. And the reason we'll only debit with the net amount is because, of course, the extra owing is the tax. And if you remember from the first bit of this chapter, any tax we've suffered, we effectively get back by deducting from any tax we collect. Now, if you're worried, be patient. It'll be very obvious in a moment. But we'll debit the purchases with 432. That's the net cost to us. The tax we've suffered will open up a sales tax account. And we'll debit that with the tax on those purchases. The tax was 75,600. We debit a debtor, a receivable, because effectively at the moment we're owed that back from the state. So although we still call it double entry, do note there are in fact 3 entries, but there's one big credit, 507, 2 smaller debits, 432 and 75, but in total the debits do equal the credits. Well, that's our purchases. What about the sales? Well, in a very similar way. We've sold goods. Normally, you either debit cash, credit sales if you're sold for cash, or if it's on credit, debit receivables because you're owed money, credit sales with the income. Well, we've sold on credit, so let's debit receivables. And the amount we're owed by the customers is the full amount, the gross amount, 733,200. And that's how much we are going to receive. When the customer pays us, debit cash, credit receivables, they'll have to pay the full amount. Where are we going to credit? Well, normally debit receivables, credit sales. However, we'll only credit sales with the net amount, 624,000. Because although we're actually charging more, remember the extra, the tax, we can't keep, we'll have to pay to the state. And so to complete the double entry, the tax, well, we'll credit our sales tax account with how much? 109,200. Credit, because that's the amount owing that we'll have to pay to the state. And again, the double entry does work with one big debit and with 2 smaller credits, but in total, debits equal credits. Now then, let's have a look at the accounts. First of all, payables and receivables. They're the amounts we owe and the amount owed to us. And I've already said that when the customer pays us, debit cash, credit receivables, they'll have to pay the full amount. And similarly, we'll have to pay our payables. What about purchases and sales? Well, the sales is the amount we can keep. So that's our income of 624. And the real expense to us is 432. And so those are the amounts that will appear in our income statement in respect of sales and purchases. Finally, though, what about sales tax? Remember, the 109,200 was the tax we've charged our customers and has to be paid to the state. But remember that the amount we pay, we deduct from that any tax we've suffered, which here is 75,600. And so, how much do we owe to the state? The balance on the account. We've charged 109,200, we've suffered 75,600. There's a balance of, you'd better check my arithmetic, but I think 33,600. And that's the final amount owing to the state. Different countries have different rules about when it's payable, but if, suppose in this case, it's payable each month, at the end of December here, we'd owe 33,600, and if we're doing a balance sheet, it would appear as a current liability. But early the following month in January, we'd actually have to pay it, and of course when we pay it, credit cash, debit the tax account, and it clears. So there we are. In fact, less likely, but you could just be tested on the basic entries.